I think Norman MacCaig is indubitably one of our greatest poets, and when I say our, I mean Britain.
A great teacher, a friend, someone I enjoy reading.
In my eye, I've no apple. Every object enters in there with hands in pockets. I welcome them all, just as they are. Everyone equal, none a stranger.
I don't call myself a poet, I call myself a retired school teacher.
Well, my mother came from the Outer Hebrides. She spoke Gaelic. When she came to Edinburgh at the age of 16, she had no English at all. But my father came from the opposite end, Dumfries. They collided in Edinburgh and see what happened. And through them, I suppose, genetically, I grew up to love the landscape of Scotland. And in my earlier days, I cycled all over the place with a tent. Most important thing, one of the big important things in my life, in fact.
Landscape and I get on together well, though I'm the talkative one. Still, he can tell his symptoms of being to me, the way a shell murmurs of oceans. Loch Rannoch lapses wimpling in the sun, its hieroglyphs of light fade one by one, but recreate themselves, their message done forever and ever. The hawk knows all about it, shaking there an empty glove on steep shoots of the air, till his yellow foot cramps on a squeal to tear smooth fur, smooth feather. That sprinkling lark, jerked upward in the blue, will daze to nowhere, but leave himself in true translation, hear his song cascading through his disappearance. This means, of course, Schiehallion in my mind is more than mountain. In it, he leaves behind a meaning, an idea like a hind couched in a corrie. So then I woo the mountain, till I know the meaning of the meaning no less. Oh, there's a Schiehallion anywhere you go. The thing is, climb it.
One day the English teacher asked us to write by next Wednesday or something, an essay on something, or a poem. Practical Scot me, I thought a poem shorter. So I wrote my first poem and got fascinated and have been a junkie for poetry ever since.
I wasn't interested in publishing at all, and it had a very bad effect because the poems became more and more and more and more private.
I'm accustomed to say every poem in these two books was a vomitorium of unrelated images. That was a surrealist influence, I think. And a friend heard one of these existed and asked to see it, and I stupidly gave it to him. No, I wasn't stupid. I was very lucky, because when he gave me it back, he said, "There's your book, Norman. When are you publishing the answers?" And I realised just exactly what rubbish I was writing and tried to become more comprehensible. The night tinkles like ice in glasses. Leaves are glued to the pavement with frost. The brown air fumes at the shop windows, tries the doors, and sidles past. I gulp down winter raw, the heady darkness swirls with tenements. In a brown fuzz of cotton wool, lamps fade up crags, die into pits. Frost in my lungs is harsh as leaves scraped up on paths. I look up. There, a high roof sails, at the masthead fluttering a grey and ragged star. The world's a bear shrugged in its den. It's snug and close in the snoring night. And outside, like chrysanthemums, the fog unfolds its bitter scent.
As a poet today, I think the amazing thing about him is his durability and his contemporaneousness. You know, he doesn't date. He's not a modish poet in any sense of the word. I think the reason for that is that the subjects he writes about are completely universal and are not time-sensitive in any sense. In other words, he doesn't write poems of the moment, you know, poems that are about public events. He's not a political poet. He's not really a religious poet. In fact, I think the main thing that Norman seems to write about is love. Love of nature, love of animals, love of people. And I think that comes through stronger and stronger the more you read his work.
I feel like writing a poem, same way as you feel thirsty and you take a drink. If possible, I sit down in that chair, which you have usurped, and quickly into my vacant head, I don't know what's coming. Not an idea, nothing. Comes a memory of a place, a person, an event, or maybe all three. Usually it's a small phrase, quite unimportant, and the poem trickles down the page till it's finished. And they come very easily, often with no changes whatever. I don't write second version, third version, fourth version, you know. And there's a snag, of course. I write a lot of duds. Boring things, not interesting. And about twice a year I look at what I've written and I throw them out, a process I relish. And I suppose, I'm sure in fact, that I put in the bucket certainly half, perhaps more, of what I write. Very slap happy, hit or miss. But it's the only way I can do it.
I think it's true that when Norman discusses poetry and when he discusses himself, and both of those he does very reluctantly, he's always laconic and very downbeat. He doesn't like to talk about the process of actually writing poetry. He says, oh, he lights a cigarette and when it's finished, that's the poem finished. That's disingenuous. It's quite clear that a lot of work goes into these poems. I understand his reluctance to expand on that. He's very anti-grandiose, anything that smacks of pretension or pomposity. He immediately wants to deflate. It's a very Scottish characteristic.
The dwarf, with his hands on backwards, sat slumped like a half-filled sack on tiny twisted legs from which sawdust might run. Outside the 3 tiers of churches built in honour of St. Francis, brother of the poor, talker with birds, over whom he had the advantage of not being dead yet. A priest explained how clever it was of Giotto to make his frescoes tell stories that would reveal to the illiterate the goodness of God and the suffering of his Son. I understood the explanation and the cleverness. A rush of tourists, clucking contentedly, fluttered after him as he scattered the grain of the word. It was they who had passed the ruined temple outside, whose eyes wept pus, whose back was higher than his head, whose lopsided mouth said grazie in a voice as sweet as a child when she speaks to her mother, or a bird's when it spoke to St. Francis.
One of the great things was his friendship with Chris Grieve, with Hugh McDermott, and he brought McDermott to the university, and they did a peculiar kind of double act. It wasn't peculiar, but it was unusual, because when MacCaig brought him to what was quite a large group of students and lecturers who came to listen to McDermott reading, and then he was available for questions. But the way in which MacCaig presented this was not saying, I have brought you Scotland's greatest living poet. He said, more or less, this is my friend Chris Grieve. He's going to read. Don't be frightened of him, ask him questions. He's a cuddly teddy bear. He always used to repeat this phrase, he's a cuddly teddy bear.
Hugh MacDiarmid, the great Scottish poet. When he speaks a small sentence, he is a man who presses a plunger that will blow the face off a cliff. Or one last small pen stroke, and the huge poem rides down the slipway, ready for enormous voyages. He does more than he does. When he goes hunting, he aims at a bird and brings a landscape down. Or he dynamites a ramshackle idea. When the dust settles, what structures shine in the sun?
The first thing I learned from MacCaig as I got to know him as a student, he was a very approachable man, was bar decorum, because Norman was available. He would, I wouldn't say hold court, but he attracted rather large gatherings of lecturers and students, and we stood around the bar in the MacRobert. Norman, remember, it was a man whose drinking days were legendary. He had been the man who drank with Sorley MacLean and Hugh MacDiarmid and Sidney Goodsir Smith. So this is a man who expected to buy drink, but also to be bought drink. That was one of the first lessons I learned from him. He told me once, there are two things to do with your hands. One is to hold a cigarette in one of them, and the other is to hold a glass in the other and never wave them about. So these were important things that I learned from MacCaig.
I enjoyed teaching very much. When I came out of training college, the teaching profession was overcrowded. And I applied for a classics job, only 4 between then and the outbreak of war. I didn't get any of them. Meanwhile, I was teaching primary school. And after the war, I thought, I like this fine primary school teaching. Life starts at 3:40. You don't take things home, corrections. And there's always another man in the school that looked after the football. That sort of thing. And I decided just to stay in primary school, which I did, till towards the end when I was degraded into being a lecturer at Stirling University, which I enjoyed very much, by the way.
There's a curious thing about MacCaig, and that is that he's a very gregarious man, but he's also a deeply private man. And in interviews it becomes very apparent that he has almost like a boxer's cover-up technique. His cover-up technique is to throw out various anecdotes which become repeated, so that whenever rather central questions with which he's uncomfortable, questions about his own standing, say, or his own motivation as a poet, and he will come out with anecdotes which he repeats. I think this is part of his self-protection repertoire, if you like.
What exactly is your position? I was going to say I'm a decorated liar, but I think I really mean a decorating liar. And behind the decorations and the lie, of course, there's skulks, the real MacCaig, whom I'm very willing to meet.
Tell me about the real MacCaig, then.
The real MacCaig, well, split him in 2. He's much more visible than that, but 2's enough. You know, the objective one that you're looking at and who's uttering these words, and the subjective one whose 5 senses, 5 ports of knowledge are delivering cargoes every minute, and who deals with these cargoes. The objective MacCaig is 6 feet high, 11.5 stones, born in Edinburgh in 1910, went to the high school and the university studying classics, and very little interesting to other people has happened to him since.
Well, he is a private man, and in some ways an enigmatic man, and he doesn't, on the whole, talk very much about himself. And there are areas of his life that don't emerge very much in his poetry. So I think it's the kind of thing that will take a while. If people want to know more about him, it'll take a while. It takes a bit of digging and a bit of sympathetic understanding. But it's a very big volume with many poems from different periods, and I think it is true that everybody, no matter how private, does reveal himself or herself in what he writes. But in his case, it's quite a hard nut to crack, and perhaps all the more interesting because of that.
Hear my words carefully. Some are spoken not by me, but by a man in my position. What right has he to use my mouth? I hate him when he touches you the wrong way. Yet he loves you also, this appalling stranger who makes windows of my eyes. You see him looking out. Until he dies of my love for you, hear my words carefully, for who is talking now?
This manner he has, some people do initially find him difficult to approach. I think it conceals a man of, or in fact fails to conceal, I think, the man of great sensitivity shows through. And in fact, some of his poems are terrifically personal. There's a sequence of poems to his friend A.K. MacLeod, Angus MacLeod, which are really very personal poems about the loss, the death of a friend. And it's not true, this slightly stereotyped image which sometimes arises that he's cold and distant. He is not. He's a man of passion which he translates into rigour in words.
This is a poem about a very, very, very close friend of mine, Angus MacLeod, up in Assynt in Lochinver. I went up in January, snow all over the place, and he arrived and met me and took me to his house, and he died the very next morning. Notes on a winter journey and a footnote. The snow is almost faultless. It bounces back the sun's light, but can do nothing with those two stags, their cold noses, their yellow teeth. On the loch's eye, a cataract is forming. Fistfuls of white make the telephone wires loop after loop of snow buntings. So few cars, they leave the snow snow. I think of the horrible marzipan in the streets of Edinburgh. The hotel at Ullapool, that should be a bang of light, is crepuscular. The bar is fireflied with whisky glasses. At Amsterdam, snow is falling. The windscreen wipers squeak, and I stare through a segment of a circle. What more do I ever do? Footnote, 17 miles to go. I didn't know it, but when I got there, a death waited for me. That segment shut its fan, and a blinding winter closed in. For most of my life, death, people use words awfully slackly, including me. And for most of my life, death was really just a concept until my friends started dying. And that made a big difference. I know death is no longer a concept, but for most of my life, that's all it was, because I've been very, very lucky. I survived 2 wars and never saw a corpse, for one thing. And my parents died over 80, and each of them died like switching a light off. Death was just a concept till my friends started dying, because friends are very, very important to me.
Everywhere she dies. Everywhere I go, she dies. No sunrise, no city square, no lurking beautiful mountain but has her death in it. The silence of her dying sounds through the carousel of language. It's a web on which laughter stitches itself. How can my hand clasp another's when between them is that thick death, that intolerable distance? She grieves for my grief. Dying, she tells me that bird dives from the sun, that fish leaps into it. No crocus is carved more gently than the way her dying shapes my mind. But I hear too the other words, black words that make the sound of soundlessness, that name the nowhere she is continuously going into. Ever since she died, she can't stop dying. She makes me her elegy. I am a walking masterpiece, a true fiction of the ugliness of death. I am her sad music.
Isabel MacCaig was a remarkable individual, really. She was very often seen as in a domestic role, serving drinks to people, bringing cups of tea, sandwiches, that kind of thing. Whereas really she was a very highly renowned lexicographer, an editor of the Oxford Idiomatic Dictionary, very persuasive, very argumentative, very biting wit of a person, who really complimented Norman and provided the circumstances that gave him some kind of domestic harmony. I mean, how many women would put up with guys turning up at 4 o'clock in the morning off the street, off the pubs? Norman wasn't even with them. Ring the doorbell, invite them in, offer them more drinks, let them stay for 3 or 4 hours and tell them to go away again. You know, she was remarkable in her tolerance, but remarkable also in her intellect, I think. And Norman was very, very lucky, you know.
Oh, it's affected me. Good gracious, yes. But she suffered so bad, so awful cancer for months. And I observed this, of course. She was here. And it was just terrible. Pain 24 hours of a day. And then she died. And I couldn't write. I couldn't write then. And since she died, I've not written either. I may be finished. High time, you might say. But I don't know. You never know. May come back.
I think he's the most honest poet I know, in that he's worked so hard to do away with the dross. There's a wonderful discipline in these poems. Seamus Heaney talks about the combination of strictness and susceptibility in his work, and it's that balance, the deep sensitivity combined with the rigour of these little forms, no longer traditional poetic forms, but rather freer, but still incredibly tight. And I think he believes his poetry gets better as it becomes tighter, and I would agree. I greatly hope that he'll write more poetry. I greatly hope that he will feel able, after some time has passed, to write about his wife Isabel, because some of the most moving poems, completely anti-sentimental but deeply moving precisely because they're not sentimental, are the poems about the deaths of his closest friends. And therefore anything he may eventually write about the death of his wife, whom he loved so much, I think would be something quite exceptional.
Honey and salt, land smell and sea smell, as in the long ago, as in forever. The days pick me up and carry me off, half child, half prisoner, on their journey that I'll share for a while. They wound and they bless me with strange gifts, the salt of absence, the honey of memory.